No one in town knew much about the man who bought the old farm at the edge of the county road. That was intentional. He didn't attend the local diner on Sunday mornings. He didn't show up at town meetings. He waved politely when waved at, nodded when spoken to, and kept his answers short. People knew only a few things. He was a war veteran, he had paid cash for the land, and he worked from sunrise to dusk without help. The farm itself had been abandoned for years. The previous owner had gone bankrupt after a series of harsh winters, and most locals believed the land was cursed by bad luck more than bad soil. When the veteran bought it, more than one neighbor quietly wondered why a man his age would choose such a place. But the veteran didn't choose the farm for comfort. He chose it for distance. Within the first few weeks, people began noticing something strange. Instead of repairing fences or fixing the old barn, he started digging. Not shallow trenches for drainage, but long, deliberate cuts into the frozen earth, running in wide arcs across the fields. At first, the neighbors assumed it was irrigation gone wrong. Then someone joked it looked like a defensive position. That joke spread faster than the truth. Probably still fighting his old wars, one man said at the diner. Another laughed. At his age? That trench won't do a thing when winter hits. The veteran heard the comments. In a small town, nothing stays quiet for long. But he didn't react. He kept digging. The trench wasn't deep enough to be a bunker, and it wasn't placed where water would naturally flow. It made no sense to anyone watching from the road. When asked directly what it was for, he gave the same answer every time. It's not for now. That only made things worse. By late autumn, the trench was finished. Clean lines, careful angles, not rushed, not improvised. The kind of work done by someone who had measured consequences before. Winter forecasts that year were grim. Early reports warned of temperatures plunging far below anything the region had seen in decades. 30 degrees, possibly 40 degrees. The town prepared the usual way, stockpiling fuel, reinforcing barns, hoping for the best. The veteran did nothing new. He stood at the edge of his land one evening, watching the sky darken earlier than it should, the wind cutting sharper each day. He walked the trench slowly, inspecting it like an old friend. Someone passing by rolled down their window and shouted, half joking, "That ditch won't save you when it drops to 40 below." The veteran looked up, expression calm. "It's not meant to," he said. The first storm arrived 3 days later, and that was when everyone learned they had misunderstood what the trench was really for. Cold only seems simple when you've never had to respect it. For most people in town, winter was something you prepared around, not for. You stocked fuel, checked heaters, made sure doors closed tight. If things went wrong, you fixed them as they broke. That had always been enough. This winter was different. The first real sign wasn't the temperature, it was the sound. When the cold deepened past what the forecast had predicted, the land stopped making familiar noises. Snow didn't crunch the same way. Metal didn't creak. It snapped. Wood complained in sharp cracks that echoed through the dark like distant gunfire. Even animals moved differently, conserving energy without being told. By the second night of the storm, the temperature dropped below 30 degrees. Wind didn't blow anymore. It scoured. It found seams in barns, gaps in doors, weaknesses no one had ever bothered to fix because they had never mattered before. On most farms, the reaction was panic disguised as activity. Men ran heaters harder than they should have. Generators that had worked for years suddenly refused to start. Diesel thickened into useless sludge. Water lines froze solid and burst when pressure built behind the ice. Livestock crowded together in tight spaces, bodies pressing against walls already rimed with frost. Breath turned into ice crystals that coated beams and ceilings. Some animals stopped eating, others simply stopped moving. The cold wasn't attacking, it was exposing. On the veteran's farm, the scene looked nothing like that. His animals weren't forced into corners. They weren't packed into barns beyond capacity. Instead, they drifted, slowly, deliberately, toward the low arc cut into the land months earlier, toward the trench. It wasn't obvious at first. The trench was shallow enough to disappear under fresh snow, but its presence altered the land in subtle ways. Wind lost its straight lines. Drifts formed unevenly, piling high in some places, leaving other sections almost bare. The animals sensed it before anyone else did. They gathered where the wind broke, where the air moved slower, where their bodies didn't bleed heat quite as fast into the night. The veteran watched this without surprise. He moved methodically, checking gates, ensuring nothing blocked the natural flow he had designed. He didn't rush. Rushing wastes energy. Panic creates mistakes. By the third morning, the temperature read 38 degrees. That was when the town crossed from inconvenience into reckoning. On one neighboring farm, a heater failed sometime before dawn. By the time it was noticed, 3 animals were already gone. On another, a generator sputtered and died after running non-stop for 48 hours. Fuel gelled. Restarting it became impossible. Men stood in barns with numb hands, staring at problems they couldn't solve quickly enough. And through it all, one detail kept spreading quietly from mouth to mouth. He's not losing any. At first, people dismissed it as rumor. Then someone drove past the veteran's land at night, headlights cutting across fields that looked strangely controlled. Snow didn't whip across his property the way it did elsewhere. The land wasn't calm, but it wasn't chaotic either. It looked like it had been shaped with intention. The trench had turned the open field into broken terrain. That mattered more than anyone realized. By the time temperatures finally touched 40 degrees, the town's focus shifted. No one was joking anymore. No one cared about being right. Survival had a way of simplifying priorities. A neighbor stopped by the veteran's gate, face red from the cold, voice rough. "How?" he asked without preamble. The veteran didn't pretend not to understand. "You can't stop cold," he said. "You can only keep it from taking everything at once." That answer lingered longer than a technical explanation would have, because it wasn't about farming. It was about mindset. While everyone else had prepared for normal winter, the veteran had prepared for failure, for systems breaking, for tools not working, for conditions worse than predicted. He had assumed something would go wrong. And when it did, his plan didn't collapse. It adapted. The cold held the town in place for days longer. Repairs became impossible. Losses mounted quietly. Men stopped counting out loud. And still, on the veteran's farm, things held. Not comfortably, not easily, but intentionally. That difference mattered. Because when the storm finally loosened its grip and temperatures crawled back toward survivable, people didn't talk about the weather anymore. They talked about decisions. And slowly, uncomfortably, they began to realize something they didn't like admitting. The trench hadn't been built for winter. It had been built for the moment when everything else failed. And that was a kind of preparation most of them had never learned to respect. There are things a man can forget. Faces fade. Names blur. Even places lose their edges with time. But certain lessons, once learned the hard way, never loosen their grip. They settle deep, becoming instinct rather than memory. The veteran didn't talk about where he learned those lessons, not because he was hiding something, but because words were always the weakest part of it. Experience didn't need translation. When the storm lingered longer than expected, stretching from days into something heavier, the town began to notice a difference that had nothing to do with temperature. The veteran wasn't tired. Other men were exhausted, worn thin by broken sleep, by constant repairs, by the mental strain of knowing that one more failure might be the one they couldn't fix in time. They moved faster than usual, talked louder than usual, made decisions just to feel like they were doing something. The veteran moved slower. That unsettled people. He checked the same things at the same times each day. Gates, feed. The edges of the trench where snow accumulated differently. He adjusted nothing unless it mattered. When something didn't need fixing, he left it alone. A neighbor watching from across the road finally said what others were thinking. "He acts like he's been through this before." The veteran heard it. He didn't respond, because in a way that was hard to explain. He had. Not this storm, not this farm, but the pattern was familiar. Pressure, scarcity, systems failing in sequence, people discovering too late which assumptions had been wrong. The trench wasn't an idea he'd come up with on the farm. It was an application. In places far removed from barns and livestock, he had learned how terrain mattered more than equipment. How wind didn't need to be strong to be deadly, just consistent. How shelter wasn't about walls, but about angles, interruptions, breaks in force. Most importantly, he had learned that plans built for average conditions collapse the moment reality stops being average. That lesson followed him home. While others in town had prepared for the winter they expected, he had prepared for the winter that would punish mistakes. The kind of winter that didn't care about optimism or tradition. That difference showed now. One afternoon, during a brief lull in the wind, a man walked the length of the road bordering the veteran's property. He stopped near the trench, studying it openly. "I kept thinking it was too shallow," the man said. The veteran nodded. "Most people dig deeper when they should dig wider." The man frowned. "Why?" "Because depth feels safer," the veteran said, "but it doesn't change what's coming at you." That was the most explanation anyone had gotten so far. It was also enough. As days passed, the town's attitude shifted again. This time more quietly. Men began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. Why had they trusted heaters that required constant power? Why had they assumed fuel would always flow? Why had they built systems that worked only as long as nothing went wrong? The answers weren't flattering. What disturbed them most wasn't that the veteran had prepared better. It was that he had prepared differently. He hadn't relied on technology alone. He hadn't trusted convenience. He had trusted the environment to behave exactly as it always does under pressure, brutally, and without exception. That kind of thinking wasn't common anymore. It required accepting that comfort is temporary and that safety often looks unnecessary right up until the moment it isn't. The storm eventually began to weaken. Wind lost its edge. The air softened just enough to allow repairs. Men slept longer than a few hours at a time. But something had shifted permanently. The trench, once a joke, now felt like a line dividing two ways of thinking. On one side, hope, tradition, and reaction. On the other, preparation, humility, and respect for reality. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The veteran noticed the looks. The hesitation before people spoke to him now. The way conversations paused when he entered a space, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. He didn't enjoy it. Attention was never the point. One evening, standing at the edge of the trench as the sky dimmed early, he ran a gloved hand along the packed snow at its rim. It held, just as it was meant to. He thought of men who hadn't trusted simple solutions because they didn't look impressive. Men who had waited for proof instead of preparing for possibility. The trench had never been about being right. It had been about not being surprised. And as the storm finally loosened its grip, the veteran understood something the town was only beginning to grasp. The danger wasn't the cold. It was the assumption that tomorrow would behave like yesterday. When the cold finally loosened its grip, it didn't leave all at once. It retreated in stages, like something unwilling to admit defeat. The temperature rose just enough to make movement easier, but not enough to erase what had happened. Snow stayed packed hard against buildings. Ice lingered in the shadows. The land carried scars that would take months to soften. People stepped back into their routines cautiously, as if the winter might change its mind. In town, conversations returned to familiar places, repairs, supplies, the cost of fuel. But they no longer sounded the same. There was less complaining, less confidence. Men spoke with the subdued tone that comes after realizing how thin the margin really is. And woven through all of it was the veteran, not his name. Not his history, just the fact of him. The jokes never came back. That absence said more than any apology could have. Men drove past his farm slower now, sometimes pretending to check the road conditions, sometimes not pretending at all. They noticed details they hadn't before. The way snow still sat differently along the land. The way the trench guided meltwater instead of letting it pool. The way the animals moved calmly even after weeks of stress. No one asked him to explain. That was another change. In the weeks that followed, quiet adjustments began appearing across the county. A new windbreak here, a shallow cut in the land there. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced, but deliberate. Men who had once trusted only machines began trusting terrain again. They stopped assuming power would always be there, that fuel would always flow, that help would always arrive in time. The storm had taken those assumptions with it. One afternoon, the veteran stood near the road repairing a gate when a truck slowed beside him. The driver didn't get out right away. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, like he was deciding whether the question he carried was worth asking. Finally, he rolled down the window. "I should have listened," the man said. The veteran looked up, expression unchanged. "Listening doesn't matter much," he replied. "What you do before things get bad does." The man nodded slowly. Then he drove on. No argument, no defense, just acceptance. That was another thing the winter had stripped away, the need to justify past decisions. There was no comfort in it anymore. As spring approached, the land softened enough to reveal the trench fully again. Without snow, it looked unimpressive. Just a long, shallow interruption in an otherwise ordinary field. Someone seeing it for the first time might still wonder why anyone would bother. But those who remembered the winter didn't wonder at all. They understood that effectiveness doesn't need to look impressive. It only needs to hold when pressure arrives. The veteran returned to his routine as if nothing had changed. He didn't walk taller. He didn't speak more. He didn't correct anyone who misunderstood what he had done. He had never needed credit. What he noticed instead was something subtler. People planned earlier now. They asked quieter questions. They stopped laughing at preparations they didn't personally understand. That shift mattered more than any recognition. One evening, long after the worst of winter had passed, a younger man stopped by the farm. He stood near the edge of the trench, hands in his pockets, studying it in silence. "My father lost half his herd," he said eventually. "Says he won't let that happen again." The veteran waited. "He wants to know if you'd look at his land. Just give an opinion." The veteran considered the request carefully. "I don't give plans," he said. "I give observations." "That's fine," the man replied. "That's what he wants." The veteran nodded once. As the man left, the veteran remained by the trench, watching the late light stretch across the field. The wind moved gently now, almost harmless. But he didn't trust it. Not because he expected another storm immediately, but because he knew better than to confuse calm with safety. The trench had done its job. Not just by breaking wind or shaping snow, but by changing how men thought about risk. It had reminded them of something older than technology and more reliable than hope. That preparation isn't pessimism, it's respect. And respect, once earned under pressure, doesn't fade quickly. That was what remained after the storm. Not fear, not admiration, but a quiet understanding. Shared mostly among men who had lived long enough to know that survival is rarely about strength. It's about seeing what others don't take seriously yet, and acting before you're forced to. Years passed the way they usually do, quietly, without asking permission. The farm aged. Fences were repaired when they needed to be. Barn boards were replaced one by one, never all at once. The land settled into a rhythm that didn't require attention, only consistency. The trench remained. Grass grew along its edges. Snow filled it each winter, then melted away. From the road, it barely looked intentional anymore. Just a shallow interruption in the field, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. But the men who remembered that winter knew. They didn't talk about it much. Stories like that don't improve with repetition. They lose something when told too often. What stayed instead was a quiet shift in behavior. People prepared earlier now. They watched forecasts longer than they used to. They stopped assuming that help would arrive on time, or that equipment would work just because it always had before. No one credited the veteran directly. That suited him fine. He had never believed that lessons needed ownership to be useful. One late autumn afternoon, as the first hints of cold crept back into the air, a man stopped by the farm unannounced. He was older than the veteran, moving carefully, like someone who had learned to listen to his joints. They stood near the trench, looking out over the field. "I used to think you were overreacting," the man said after a while. The veteran didn't respond. "I don't anymore." The veteran nodded once. That was all that needed saying. The truth was, the trench hadn't worked because it was clever, or because it was new, or because it was dramatic. It worked because it was built around a simple acceptance most people resist. Things fail. Not sometimes, not unusually. They fail eventually. Machines stop. Power disappears. Plans unravel. And when that happens, what remains is whatever doesn't depend on things behaving nicely. The trench didn't need electricity. It didn't need fuel. It didn't require maintenance under pressure. It didn't ask for attention when conditions turned hostile. It simply existed, doing what it had been shaped to do. That was the difference. Most preparations are designed to make life easier. This one had been designed to make failure survivable. As the veteran aged, his movements slowed slightly. Not enough to be noticed by strangers, but enough that he felt it. He planned his days with more care now, spacing tasks, conserving energy. But the trench never concerned him. It didn't demand strength. It didn't depend on speed. It would outlast him. That thought didn't bother him. If anything, it reassured him. Because he had never built it for a single winter. He had built it because he understood something many men only learn late, if at all. Preparation isn't about predicting the future. It's about refusing to be surprised by it. On the coldest nights, when wind pressed against the farmhouse and snow hissed across the land, the veteran slept without interruption. Not because he believed nothing could go wrong, but because he had already accounted for what usually does. Years later, someone asked him once why he hadn't filled the trench back in after that winter. "Didn't see the point," he said. "Why not?" "Because it already did what it was meant to do." They assumed he meant it had saved the farm. He didn't correct them. What it had really done was quieter. It had reminded a handful of men that most disasters aren't sudden. They're gradual. They arrive while people are still debating whether preparation is necessary. The trench had answered that question without words. When the temperature hit 40 degrees, hope wasn't enough. Experience was. Acceptance was. Respect for reality was. And among all the things men had tried that winter, heaters, generators, last-minute fixes, the trench was the only thing that didn't ask the world to behave differently. It worked because it didn't rely on optimism. It relied on understanding. That was why, when everything else struggled, failed, or broke under pressure, the trench remained. Not impressive, not celebrated, just quietly doing what it had been built to do. And for a man who had learned his lessons the hard way, that was the only kind of solution worth trusting.